It's time to talk about decals. Decals? Decals? Those water slide transfer things. Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. Now, regardless of what you call them, putting the transfers on your models can sometimes be an intimidating process, especially if you've not done it before. But I think if you know some simple tools to use and some basic theory of why things happen the way they do, then it's going to help you with getting those on your model without any problems. So that's what this video is going to be all about. I'm going to talk about the tools, the process, some problems you may run into, how to mitigate those problems, and most importantly, I'm going to demonstrate putting some decals or decals or water slides or those thingies on the model. For the tools, I like to have some cotton buds handy, this piece of paper towel folded up. Well, I'll use that to dab off water from the model, and I also keep a piece of paper towel just sitting by handy to set decals on and things like that. Tweezers are very, very useful in the decal setting, the decal placing process. I just got these with these very sharp pointy tips on them. They work really well. My hobby knife, I always use that. I always put in a new blade each time I'm doing decals to make sure that I'm getting a nice, good cut whenever I'm cutting decals away from the sheet. And then I have 3 or 4 paint brushes standing by. One I'll reserve for just plain water to wet the surface of the model or to add water to the decals, maybe to help move the decal around on the surface. And then I'll use two of the other two for the setting solutions, which I'll talk about in just a moment, so that I don't get those mixed in with the regular water that I'm putting on the model. And then finally, I have a coffee cup full of warm water, and I keep it on a coffee warmer. I have a Mr. Coffee brand coffee warmer that I set it on. There's plenty of other brands available, I'm sure. The key is it's warm water and it stays warm. Now, how warm is it? It's coffee warm. I put it in, I either get hot water from the sink or I heat it up in the microwave. But if you were drinking it as coffee, it would be hot coffee. You don't want it boiling hot. You don't want it too cool. But coffee hot is the way to do it. And if you're interested in this really nice johnbias.com scale models mug, there's going to be a link for that down below where you can pick one of those up from my merch store. So anyway, just a shameless plug there. Now, one of the most important things to keep in mind is that the decal process works best when you put them over a smooth surface. If it's got a lot of texture to it, it's going to be more difficult to get out any air bubbles underneath the decal and get the decal to adhere nicely. It's not impossible, certainly, if you've seen models of tanks or machining krieger kits that have surface texture, they have decals on those, and you can get them down very nicely. But knowing some of the basics of what causes things like silvering and what causes decals not to stick will help you make sure that you don't run into any of those problems. Now, the most common way to prepare the surface for decals is to give a model a gloss coat. That can be something like, I use Pledge floor polish. I airbrush that on. I've used that for years and I like it. It can be a rattle can gloss coat. It can be something airbrushed on that's acrylic or lacquer. The type of gloss coat is less important than the fact that there is a gloss coat. Now, there are times when a gloss coat isn't necessary. When I'm putting on very small stencils or just a few decals on a model, very few small decals, I'll often do either a spot gloss application, just take my paintbrush and drop a bit of gloss right there that's just going to be underneath the decal, or I may use some various setting solutions. There have been times I've even just taken a cloth and just buffed out the area that I'm going to put the decal on so that it's got a nice smooth surface. Once you've got some experience working with decals, you'll know where you can get away with not putting a gloss coat or when you do need a gloss coat. even with all the decals I've put on models, if I'm going to be putting on a large number of decals, I just go ahead and gloss coat it. Now, if you're saying, well, why wouldn't you gloss coat it? Maybe you're going to be doing later steps that require weathering that goes down better over a satin or a matte surface. So it's just a time-saving measure in my view. That's why I do it. Maybe if I've just got a few stencils to put on, I'll put those down, use some setting solutions, get the decals in place, and then I can just go right into the weathering, and I don't have to worry about adding some kind of coat over the gloss coat. The basic thing to remember though is if you're not sure whether you should gloss coat, go ahead and gloss coat. It's not going to create any problems to do that. And then you can later go back and add some kind of coating over that, satin or matte or whatever you're going to need for the follow-on steps. Now for the various setting solutions and softeners, I generally put down a setting solution and then go over the top of the decals with a softening solution. I use Solvaset for my softening solution. I use that 100% of the time on decals. I always use that. Depending on the surface of the model I'm using and the decals that I'm using, I may or may not use a setting solution. What a setting solution does is just basically prepare the surface, gets it nice and slick for the decal to go on. It helps reduce silvering. It helps with adhesion, and it just softens them up just a little bit to get them onto the surface nicely. Now, that can be especially important if the decal you have has a lot of clear film around it. Let's say it's stencils or numbers or lettering or anything that may have some open areas of the decal film. Then you're going to want to use something like this to pull that down to the surface and to prevent silvering and bubbles and things like that. You don't want to use this type of thing. Anything that's designed to be the post treatment once you get the decal on, you don't want to use it first because these tend to be a lot hotter. They're going to melt the decal a little bit. I know this says that it does it, but it does it, it softens it very, very, very little. This one, you put this on and then give it a minute and try and move it with a brush and you'll smear the decal. So any of the post application fluids that you use, regardless of the brand, you don't want to use them for the pre-treatment. But these for the pre-treatment are especially useful if there is going to be a lot of clear film. Now, you don't have to use a commercial treatment like this. I've used just plain old water to help decals settle onto the surface. Just put a drop of water. I've used Pledge gloss coat. So any kind of gloss coat, just a drop of it will help pull the decal down on the surface. If you open this bottle up and smell it, it smells a whole lot like vinegar. I know a lot of modelers, especially from many years ago, who would just use plain old white vinegar, just a clear vinegar, to put on their model as a surface treatment to help the decals adhere. So having these, you're going to want to have these, if you can, standing by. But I would say this is the type of thing you're going to use 100% of the time, the post-treatment. The pre-treatment, you may not use every time. If in doubt, if you're not sure what you should do, use a pre-treatment each time until you get comfortable with the process and can make some informed decisions about, do I need it or do I not need it? It doesn't hurt to use it. So that's kind of the rule of thumb I would say to go by. Most decals that you use are going to be printed with, they'll take a sheet of decal paper, and then there will be a printing process that puts down the ink that makes up the decals, and then there will be a final process that puts down what's called the carrier film. On most decals, the carrier film will be confined to the areas that the ink is, so you won't have the whole sheet covered with it. Some aftermarket decals that are produced at home, small shop kind of productions, they may overcoat the entire sheet, so you'll need to be aware of that. Now, it is the decal film, the carrier film, that is going to be the culprit when you might see silvering. Now, silvering is when you put a decal, let's say I want to use this 0 number right here. When there is some carrier film in the middle of that 0. So when I put the decal down, if any air bubbles form underneath this part of the carrier film, when that's later dry and maybe there's been, especially if there's been a matte coat applied towards the end of the process of building the model, that bubble is going to reflect light. There's going to be a surface under there that's going to reflect light, and it's going to look in certain, when you look at it in certain lights, it's going to appear silver. That's why it's called silvering. So be aware that wherever there is carrier film that doesn't have any kind of coloring underneath it, you may have a chance for silvering. In looking at the tools, I'd mentioned I like to put a new blade in my hobby knife to cut out decals. I recommend using a knife like this, not scissors. This is going to make a much cleaner cut. That's why I recommended the new blade. It's going to make a much cleaner cut, and it's going to allow you to be much more precise about the cut. Now, after all the talk of putting the decals on, the actual application is going to be a little bit anticlimactic, I think. I'm going to take my decal that I've got in my handy dandy tweezers here, and I'm going to stick it down in my hot water, which is off camera, and I'm going to hold it for just a few seconds, exactly this much time. And I'm going to set it right there on my little piece of paper towel. And I'm going to get one of my brushes that I've got standing by, and I'm going to put microset on it. Now, microset will bead up very easily on a glossy surface, so you only need a little bit. You don't need to coat it because it will spread out underneath. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slide that decal off here, and this can be the tricky part. Putting it in place, sometimes it'll stick to your finger. Sometimes I use tweezers. I just adjust it depending on the model and the decals. But now I've got a brush full of water here, and I'm just going to put that on there to kind of float that over a little bit. The decal is actually floating on the water. And then I'm going to live dangerously. You may not want to do this, but I'm going to live dangerously, and I like to use the tip of my hobby knife. And I'm just going to gently nudge that over in place, and I'm just trying to get it straight like that. Now, for doing that on camera, I think that's close enough. Maybe I can adjust it a little more over here. You see, this is real time here. This is showing what applying a decal is all about. Now, the decal is floating on that water, as I mentioned, so when I go to use my Q-tip to dab it off, I don't start at the top and roll down, because that will push the decal along the film of water. I start in the middle, and then I roll one direction, and then I start in the middle, and I roll the other direction, and that kind of gives it some stability, and then I can start rolling the Q-tip like that and working out all the bubbles and things like that. I'm not putting any pressure on it. I'm just gently squeegeeing that water out from underneath the decal. Just like that. Now, once I've got it on there, I'll switch to the other end, which is a little drier, and I'm going to push down on it a little more. Again, I want to get all the bubbles out, because it's this area here where the film is, and right along between them, all those open spaces, that's where I'm concerned about getting any silvering. Then, once I have that on, I'll bring my Solvaset into the picture, and I'll get some of that on there, and I'll paint it over the whole decal. I'm not stingy with this stuff. I put it on because I want it to work. I want it to soften that decal up. Once you get the Solvaset on there, set it down. Don't touch it. Don't adjust it. Don't mess with it. Leave it be for at least 15-20 minutes. That right there, that's the process of putting on a decal. Now you just have to go through and do it a bazillion more times. Once the decal is in place, I generally want to give it about 15 to 20 minutes to dry before I do anything else. Now that Solvaset and the decal itself won't actually be really dry for several hours. So keep that in mind as you're working with it. But I go ahead and I put on other decals and just making sure not to touch the ones that I've already placed on there, of course. After about 20 minutes, if there are any panel lines that run through a decal, I'll take my X-Acto knife and just make a really light slice through that panel line. And then I'll add some more Solvaset right there along that panel line. And that'll help draw the decal into the panel line and really make it look good. Now, if you see any silvering after it dries up, and don't worry about the silvering while the decal is drying. If you see any bubbling or anything like that, leave it be. A lot of those bubbles will settle out as the decal dries out. But once it's dry, and if you see any bubbles in it, or if you see any wrinkles or anything that may give away the fact that it's a decal, then what you're going to want to do is make just a little slice or a little pinhole wherever that bubble is, wherever that silvering looks to be, and apply a little more setting solution where you made that slice, and it'll go in there and it'll get rid of that silvering, that air underneath. It'll pull the decal down, and then you won't have to worry about it. Now, of course, there's always the chance that later on, let's say you put a satin or a matte coat over the decal and you notice some silvering that you may have missed. Dealing with that is real simple. There's three primary ways that I do that. And if I wouldn't have held up three fingers, you totally wouldn't have understood the concept of three. Anyway, there's three ways I do it. First, if I see any silvering after I've put those other coatings on, I'll just go ahead and make another slice in it, put a pinhole in it, something like that, and just touch it with a drop of that Solvaset. Quite often that will get pulled down into it, and that'll be enough to take care of the silvering, to take care of the problem. If that doesn't work, another solution I use is to get the base color of whatever's underneath it, and I just put a little dab of paint on there. If the model's been given a satin coat or a matte coat or something like that, generally it's not too hard to get some paint to blend in there and get rid of that silvering. So that's another way I do it. And then finally, the easy way out, and this goes for a lot of things that are, may not, where you don't see anything that's just right on your model, slap some weathering on it. A mud streak, a paint chip. There's times I'll actually just use the tip of my X-Acto knife and literally just chip the decal, just scrape some of it off to make it appear as if it's weathered. So weathering is a real simple way to take care of any silvering. Now sometimes the decal that you're working on may have to go over a curved surface, and it may not always conform perfectly to that curved surface. And you may not be able to get all of the wrinkles out of it. Don't worry about it. There's several ways of dealing with that. One is just to push it down as best you can, then put some Solvaset on it, let it dry, and then go back in any areas where there's any remaining wrinkles, make a slice through it, put on the Solvaset, and that'll take care of it. Another thing I like to do is if it's going over a fairly curvy surface, say like when you're building, if you're building in the airplane world, if you're building a P-40 Flying Tiger with the shark's mouth on the air intake at the front, I like to slice those up into about 3 or 4 pieces, and that way each piece will conform to the section that it's on, and then I can just match them up as I move them down around under the curvature of the model. But there's not a lot of wrinkling going on because those slices are smaller and able to conform to the surface that they're on. It can be a little tricky because it can be hard to align it sometimes if you're not careful, but it's a great way to deal with decals on a curved surface. Another thing you may run into is wrinkling. Sometimes the decal will wrinkle up on your tweezers as you're pulling it off the paper, as you're trying to move it around, it will fold over. If that happens, don't panic. Don't start stabbing at it with your knife yet. What I generally try to do is I will flood the surface with water. I'll use my paintbrush, with one of the ones that I've been using for water only, and I'll just flood the surface with it and try and float the decal up, and then see if using my tweezers, my finger, the tip of my knife blade, if I'm really careful, I'll try to unfold it. It can be difficult, and sometimes if a decal folds over on itself, there have been times I've just not been able to recover from it, and there's not much you can do about it. They are very fragile, so be very careful when you're applying them. But in some cases, you can get them to unfold, to unravel, and you just have to work very carefully at grabbing the edges, at moving the edges around. Water is going to be your friend in doing that. A lot of water will help unfold a decal that's wrinkled up. Once you have your decals on and you've taken care of any problems and you've made any slices in it for panel lines and you've done all the things that I've talked about in this video, the final thing you need to decide is, what do you put over it after that? And I have to give a politician's answer there, because it depends. It's going to depend on what you need to do next. So think in terms of what's going to come after the decals. I generally put the decals on right after the base paint, and then I may go in and put panel line washes. I may do airbrush distressing or oil paint distressing of the paint itself, and also kind of start weathering the decals. There may be mud effects, there may be streaking, there may be all sorts of things. So consider what's going to come next. Now, let me give you a few for instances about what may come next. One of the things I like to do is put my panel line washes right after the decals. So quite often what I'll do is I'll put a gloss coat over the decals before doing the panel line wash, to make sure that the panel line wash doesn't get up underneath the decal. Now, that may be spraying a whole new gloss coat over the model, or it may just be taking a brush and some of my gloss and just spot touching, doing some touch-ups over the decals themselves to cover them up and to make sure they're sealed against any of the washes getting underneath it. And then I can go in and put on my washes, and those go really well over a gloss surface, and then I can put whatever I need to over that. Now, sometimes if I'm going to be making a model a little grimier, I may not gloss coat it. I may not want a gloss coat to do the panel lining, to do the other steps. So then in that case, I would put a satin coat or maybe even a matte coat over the decals. So the decals don't necessarily have to have a gloss coat over them to seal them in. They just generally need something over them to protect them from the later steps to come. But what that is will depend entirely on what you're trying to achieve after the decals. Well, I hope this video has been helpful to you. I hope that if you're an experienced modeler, that maybe it's given you a few things to think about, maybe a few additional tools to put in your toolkit that will help you in your decal process. And if you're new to the process or unfamiliar with it, haven't done it before, hopefully this will give you the information that you can use to begin applying Waterslide decals. Now, there's a lot of other things that you will probably encounter on social media, other suggestions, other ways of doing it perhaps. Try those out. Everyone tends to arrive at a slightly different process for how they like to do decals. What I've told you is not the way, it's just a way. So this is not the Mandalorian, it's just a way. It's worked for me, I've used it for years. So I'm confident that it can work. But again, try it out, do some tests, see what works for you, make adjustments where necessary, and experience will count so much in making the process of adding Waterslide decals to your model simple, and they'll look really great. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still watching at this point of the video. I always appreciate the people who watch all the way to the very end, and sometimes I like to have a little fun And so if you're still watching at this point, drop a comment down below if you would that says, put those stickers on. and we'll know what it is, and everybody who doesn't watch the whole video will be going, what are they talking about? And we'll just have a little fun with that. So that'll be our little secret. Now, of course, down below I've got all of the social media links and all of the places that you can find me. So if you're on one of those platforms, please connect with me there. There's also a subscribe button down somewhere over here, so be sure and hit that and hit the little bell icon so that you'll know when I have new videos coming out. And if you would, give this video a like. That really helps me as I try to grow the channel. Every like, every comment, every share on social media, every share, you know, if you have a Facebook community tab, when you share on there, it helps me. So I'm grateful for any support I can get in trying to grow the channel. There's also links down below to Patreon. If you would like to look at what I offer to patrons to help support the work that I do, please take a look at that link. And if you're already a patron, thank you so much for helping me bring these videos to everybody. I am so grateful, and I hope that the additional benefits you get as a patron, I hope those are being beneficial to you, and that you're enjoying those. And I and my family thank you so much for the support you give us. It truly is a blessing. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.